Hello everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our 5-minute Bible study through Exodus chapter 9 today. As always, free handout down in the description. There's a link to our website. Okay, when did the events of chapter 9 take place? Well, Moses was born approximately 1591 BC. He lived in Egypt and he grew up there for 40 years, and then he left and he went to a place called Midian. He was in Midian for 40 years also, and then in the story that we're going to read about today, he is 80 years old as he stands before Pharaoh as God's representative. In terms of our characters, we have the Israelites. These are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are Moses' people, and they are currently enslaved in Egypt. Next, we have Moses himself, who's going to be really our main character throughout the book of Exodus. He was a Hebrew who grew up in the house of Pharaoh, but he, as we mentioned, left Egypt for a time, but God called him back to free his people from slavery. Next, we have Aaron. Aaron is Moses' brother. He is a member of the tribe of Levi. Then final character for this chapter is Pharaoh. He is the king of Egypt. He's really stubborn. He's fighting against God's command to let the Israelites go from slavery. Our map hasn't changed since chapter 7 or chapter 8. The events of this chapter took place in Egypt. The Israelites lived in a region of Egypt known as Goshen. We are in the midst of talking about the 10 plagues that God sent on the Egyptian nation because of Pharaoh's stubborn heart and his disobedience to God's commands. We've talked about 4 plagues so far: water being turned to blood, frogs, flies, gnats, and today in verses 1 through 7 we're going to talk about the 5th plague, which is the disease of the livestock. So Moses returned to Pharaoh, and he once again told him that God wanted him to let the Israelites go. But again, Pharaoh refused to do it. And so God sent a plague on the livestock of the Egyptians, and it killed the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks, and it devastated their livestock population. But that only affected the Egyptians' livestock. All of the Israelite livestock wasn't affected by it. They didn't die and didn't catch the disease. But after the plague, Pharaoh hardened his heart again, and he still refused to let the people go. In our second section, verses 8 through 12, God sends another plague, seemingly pretty immediate after the 5th plague, and that is the 6th plague, a plague of boils and sores. So God told Aaron to take a handful of soot from the kiln and to throw it into the air. And when he did that, the soot became dust, and it covered the land of Egypt. And the dust caused a disease of boils and sores to break out on the Egyptians. However, after this plague was over, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. So we're in 6 plagues. Pharaoh still hasn't changed his mind. However, at this point, the land of Egypt it's had some rough times, and it's only going to get rougher. Verses 13 through 35, we're going to talk about the 7th plague, the hail. So once again, God commanded Pharaoh to let the people go. And God planned to send more plagues on Egypt. They were meant to be a display of his power. And God said that his name would be, quote, proclaimed in all of the earth. God told Pharaoh that he had actually elevated him to the throne for this very purpose, so that God's name, the true God, would be shown to be powerful and glorious among all the nations that heard about Egypt's downfall in the future. So Pharaoh's pride and his stubborn heart would ultimately work out for the glory of God. Moses was supposed to go to the Egyptians and warn them that God was going to send, quote, very heavy hail the following day, and that they needed to get their possessions, their family, and their animals into shelter, or else they were going to be killed by this hail. And the next day, sure enough, Moses stretched out his staff towards heaven, and God rained hail and thunder and lightning on Egypt. The hail destroyed everything that wasn't sheltered. That included people, plants, animals, trees, everything. But the hail didn't come down on the Israelites. It was only on the Egyptians and their households. Pharaoh finally admitted that he had sinned against God, and he pled with Moses to go to God and ask for the hail to stop. But guess what? As soon as the hail stopped, Pharaoh, quote, sinned yet again and hardened his heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. And so as we conclude Exodus chapter 9, we've talked about 7 plagues. Water turned to blood, frogs, flies, gnats, the disease of the livestock, the boils and sores, and then the hail that fell on Egypt. So Egypt is in a pretty sorry state. We'll pick up on this story in the next chapter, but let's talk about an application as we close for today. Pride can destroy a person, their family, their livelihood, and their nation. Pharaoh would not accept the fact that God was greater than him and that God was using a Hebrew to humble him. No doubt all of those years of being praised and worshiped and being told how great he was had gotten to Pharaoh's head. So the application for us is that we need to be careful how we allow ourselves to think of ourselves. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom.